Okay, so I think we'll start. So hello everyone, and welcome to Climate Exchange session 2. Thank you again for attending the previous event and for coming in today. As you can see from Celia's face, we're very excited about today's topic, which is personal behavior and climate change. And this session will be recorded as per usual. I'd like to welcome Dr. Neil Jennings, who is working at the Grantham Institute as Partnership Development Manager. He has a specific interest in the co-benefits of climate action, as in how tackling climate change can help create a cleaner, greener, and fairer future, and how these co-benefits can be better considered in the decision-making process. Prior to joining Imperial, Neil ran an international pro-environmental behavior change campaign called the Student Switch Off for 11 years. He will be opening the session with facts and figures about different actions we can take on a personal level to tackle climate change. Like last time, we'll then split into different breakout rooms where you'll be able to exchange on your personal experiences. Right now we'll post, I think, the link for you to assess your carbon footprint in the chat. So if you have 2 minutes, could you possibly complete it if you haven't done already? And it'll be interesting for the following discussions. Neil?
Great, thanks very much, Felix, and to all the organisers for putting this on. And great to be here, and hope that all of your first couple of months of the course has gone well. So I don't think anything more needs to be said in terms of introduction, but I'm just delighted to have the opportunity to be able to present to you today. And yeah, we'll be talking about the personal action on climate change. So in terms of the rough structure of how the next hour or so will be broken up, I'll talk for 20 to 25 minutes. Specifically around a document called 9 Things You Can Do About Climate Change that I'll explain shortly. We'll then have about 10 minutes for question and answers, and then we'll go into breakout groups for 15 or so minutes and then come back. So, okay, so I should start off, I suppose, by contextualizing it in terms of what I've been asked to talk about today, and recognizing that we're not ignoring a significant part of the behavioural change piece, and not putting, not suggesting that it's the personal action that's the only thing that's important at all. That's not what I'm in any way going to be suggesting. But I have been given a kind of a remit within the stuff I cover off to talk about what we can do on a personal basis. The next term, as part of the mitigation course, I'll be giving a seminar with all of you in more detail about the behavioural change element of stuff. So I'll try and keep separate from what I'm going to cover then. But in terms of situating this particular presentation, I think this quote from Greta Thunberg is quite a nice one, where she suggests that we need a system change rather than individual changes, but you can't have one without the other. The point of individual action is to create an opinion. You reduce your own carbon footprint and also send a message to other people that the climate crisis is a real thing. And that helps to push a political movement. As I say, next term, we'll be discussing in more detail the kind of slightly more stuff around the system change. But today we'll be focusing on what we can do on a personal level to reduce our own impact on climate change. So Felix has already mentioned the World Wildlife Fund's carbon footprint tool. And so in the interest of transparency, I thought I would share my results from doing that same footprinting exercise. So for those of you who've had a go at the tool, it basically asks you a variety of different questions about your day-to-day lifestyles, the things you eat, how you transport decisions that you make, the things you buy, and so on. And then it gives you an indication of your carbon footprint. So on the left-hand side here is my carbon footprint, which at the moment is approximately 8.2 tons of carbon dioxide per year. And on the right-hand side of the kind of scales is the indication of the where the target value should be for someone in the UK at the moment, which is 10.5 tons of carbon dioxide. And the percentage basically suggests that I am slightly below where I need to be, if you like, on a trajectory to getting to net zero in this case, by 2045. So if I was 100% in this case, then I would be at 10.5 tons, I would be at where I need to be, but I'm slightly below that level at the moment, which is just as well given that work in the environmental sector. And I'll come on to some of the more kind of detail about the specific aspects of the behaviours that make up some of these carbon footprint with the next few slides. So hopefully I'll just shuffle the images over to the side so you can see this. we go. At the Grantham Institute, we often get approached by members of the public saying, you know, we get climate change, we understand why we need to do, why more action is required at all scales, but we just don't really know where to start. So in light of that, we reached out to all the scientists across college who have an interest in work on climate change to get their input on what they thought were the most important things that individuals could do in their day-to-day lives about climate change. And so we put together this document, both in kind of physical form as a pamphlet, and also as an online piece, which kind of outlines 9 key things that we think most people can do to reduce their impact on climate change. And what I'll do is I'll go through these 9 things now. And so before the seminar, Celia shared with me some of the kind of inputs from across the members of the course on specific questions that you have about action on climate change. And so where possible, I've tried to weave in some of those answers to those questions that have been raised. I certainly won't be able to answer all of them, but I'll answer a few of them in this presentation. Some of the specific 9 actions I'll go through quite quickly, others I'll provide a bit more detail on, and that just relates to partly the content that's available, but also the number of questions that came up from you on those particular topics. The first of the things that we can do about climate change is make your voice heard by those in power. So this is the importance of letting our elected officials know that we think climate change is an important issue and we want them to be taking more action on it. And this is really important in terms of the fact that, you know, our elected officials will only go as far as they think is acceptable, and in terms of what is represented by the demand of the public, and that those actions that are then taken by politicians set in place the structures and the support mechanisms that can increase the chance of us as individuals being able to make pro-environmental behaviour changes in our own lives, as well as, you know, directly reducing the emissions of particular sectors of the economy, whether that be around food or aviation or other forms of transport. So the second of the specific recommendations is around eating less meat and dairy. And this is the one where I'll go into a bit more detail on. So on a global level, approximately 26% of all emissions of greenhouse gases come from the food sector. Within that sector, 58% of that 26% relate to animal products. And then within that animal products section, half of those emissions come from beef and lamb. And so this is a kind of screenshot from a BBC article, and I've, where possible, included the link so you can follow stuff back afterwards, and the slides will be shared. And for those of you interested in the food piece, I'd really recommend reading this Poor and Nemechek article from Science in 2018. It was an incredibly detailed piece looking at the carbon emissions and greenhouse gas emissions of food across the entire supply chain. And I'll elaborate on some of that other content now. So another site I would recommend checking out for kind of quite beautiful visualizations of climate related stats is a website called Our World in Data. So they took the data that Poor and Nemechek had put together in their academic article, and then have kind of represented that in ways which are, I think, quite easy to understand. So this graph here basically shows the greenhouse gas emissions associated with a number of different food products, and the different colors that you've got for each of the different bars represents a different part of the supply chain. So in green, you've got emissions from land use change. In brown, emissions that come directly from the farm. In orange is the animal feed. Blue is the processing emissions. Red is transport. Yellow is retail. And in the kind of beige is emissions from packaging. And the key take-home message, which you can probably see from this, is that the emissions from beef and lamb are exceptionally high in comparison to all other forms of meat and all other forms of food products. And that's particularly because cows are ruminant animals who produce a lot of methane. So they have a multi-chambered stomach, and they ruminate, which emits a lot of methane. Actually, more of it comes from their burping rather than from their farting. That's an interesting pub quiz question for you. But you can see basically the impact that the beef sector in particular has in terms of this is the unit is the greenhouse gas emissions per kilo of food produced. And this takes into account, as I say, the impact that has taking place in terms of the deforestation to then produce the land, to then rear the animals, through to the emissions that come from the actual growing of the animals, through the transport side of stuff as well. And one thing which I also take from this as well is you'll see that in the red sections, which is the transport things, the majority of the different sections of food, the transport is really, really small proportion. So you often sometimes have this question about, should I buy something, a product from the UK or from Spain or from New Zealand or whatever? Well, it will have an impact in terms of where it comes from, but actually the bigger impact is what you choose to buy rather than where it comes from, because the transport emissions of food typically make up a very small proportion. Obviously, the proportion that transport emissions make up it depends on how good or bad that particular product is in the first place. If you've got something like beef, which is massive in terms of emissions, then inevitably the transport thing is going to make a much smaller proportion than something like an apple, which is very little emissions associated with it, and therefore the transport side of stuff is going to be a higher proportion. So you'll see here you've got beef and lamb, which are particularly high. Cheese, as a product which comes from the dairy industry, are relatively high. Chocolate is high, particularly because of the land use change that it brings about to grow that product. Prawns, relatively high. One of they're particularly high. But you can see that in comparison to other meat products, beef and lamb are, more than twice as high as or more than 3 times as high as the next nearest product, which is in this case pigs and poultry. So anyway, so there you go. That's some indication of the different emissions from different sources of food. I'm just going to move the bar back up here so I can navigate again. And then here's the kind of emissions associated with different kind of groups of diets. So we put this together with data from the Poor and Nemechek article. So basically suggesting that a high meat diet, and a high meat diet is defined as being 2 sausages a day or 1 beef burger a day. A high meat diet is more than 2.5 times the greenhouse gas emissions compared to a vegan diet. And so the unit here is the yearly greenhouse gas emissions in tons of carbon dioxide equivalent from different diets. So I guess it suggests that you can also get relatively close to a vegetarian diet by having a low meat diet as well. And obviously kind of a flexitarian diet, which is, where you're trying to reduce meat, but you're not entirely vegetarian, would be somewhere between the low meat and the pescatarian in terms of the values. There's lots of other questions which often comes up in the food side of stuff. So I've tried to preempt or answer some of them here. The one is around seasonality. So and it depends on the specific product, but the season in which you eat the food can make a difference as to its carbon footprint. So in most countries, apples come into season in the autumn. So if I choose to eat a UK grown apple in the spring, that apple will have had to been kept in close to freezing at 1 degree Celsius for the previous 6 or so months. And the emissions embedded in the freezing process will mean that that apple will have twice the amount of emissions as it would have had I've ate that same apple in the autumn. If I choose in spring to have, rather than a UK apple, I choose to have a New Zealand apple, then that, due to the transport emissions, that apple will have 3 times the emissions that it would have done had I've had a UK apple in the autumn. So it's a bit of a minefield to kind of think about all these different things when you're going about making your day-to-day decisions, but to say that seasonality does make a difference, and you can see that transport also does make a difference. And as I said earlier, transport makes a particular difference in terms of the proportion when you're eating low carbon products. When you're eating high carbon products, the transport stuff will always be pretty minimal. And then so some of the other stuff in terms of food is just worth mentioning. So in terms of the questions about moving towards a lower meat diet, often questions come up around, will I be getting enough protein? So an interesting stat is that the average person in the UK gets 45 to 55% more protein than they need in their day-to-day diets. So in general, it's quite straightforward to move to a lower meat diet and still get the protein that you need. Having said that, we do need to be careful in terms of the impact that can have. So generally speaking, a lower meat diet is also really good for our health. It's helpful for reducing risks of heart disease or various forms of cancer. but there's also needs to be a bit careful in terms of the impacts it can have upon protein intake, and also some other key minerals such as calcium and vitamin B12. And indeed, I added this in after seeing an article which came out just today, which was an Oxford University study, which found that vegans had a 43% higher chance of having broken bones. And this is particularly because of being more likely to be underweight and having a lower than safe BMI, body mass index value, and also potentially lacking in calcium and protein. So lower meat diet, completely achievable in terms of health, but people do need to be a bit careful in terms of the supplements that may need to be taken in some cases. And I suppose the proof of the pudding in terms of the fact that you can have a very low meat or vegan diet while performing at the highest possible level is the illustration of some of the sport stars here who are best in their field while also being vegans as well. And this also gave me an opportunity to get in an Arsenal player into the presentation as well. For those of you not aware, that's Hector Bellerin on the right hand side, as well as Lewis Hamilton and Serena Williams. Anyway, so the next of the actions that we kind of recommend is cutting back on flying, which I'm sure you're familiar with and is a pretty straightforward one. But some stats I will throw into the mix are that only 1%, so 1% of the global population is responsible for half of all international aviation emissions, and that 15% on a UK level, 15% of the UK population is responsible for 70% of aviation emissions, and that in an average year, almost half of the UK population doesn't fly. That's why, in terms of a kind of a policy response to this, lots of organisations are calling for something like a frequent flyer levy as a kind of an incremental price that we would put on the cost of flights that would go up the more someone flies, as a way to not necessarily put off people who are only flying once a year, but to specifically target and add an appropriate cost to those people who are the frequent flyers, who are responsible for a high proportion of the emissions. And as I say, there's kind of you can see from the stats, there is a kind of a justice element to this, to the extent that it's quite a small proportion of the global population that are responsible for a very high proportion of emissions from this sector. So just thinking about this and thinking about the alternatives that exist, with some of the Grantham PhD students last year, we put together a series of graphics which looked at the cost, the time and the carbon emissions of going from London to various other destinations on the near continent, so from Paris to Amsterdam, Barcelona and a few others, and gave some indications of the difference it would take to get from London to there. So this is an example from London to Amsterdam, where if you book in advance, it's actually cheaper to go by train, so you can go directly from London now. It will take you less time once you take into account all of the extra check-in time that you have with airports, which you don't have with trains. And in terms of your carbon emissions from that particular choice of mode of transport, your carbon emissions would be 20 times higher had you gone by plane versus going by train. So this was trying to kind of illustrate the multiple benefits that going via a lower carbon form of transport can have. But clearly, lots of technological potential or the necessity for technological improvements as well in this particular sector if we are going to carry on travelling as much as we do at the moment. So the fourth of our suggestions was around leaving the car at home. So thought I'd just quickly set out the kind of mitigation hierarchy when it comes to transport, which is, I suppose, relevant at the moment with us, in many cases, being forced to work from home. So staying home being the best thing, then walking and cycling to where we're going to get to, then the use of transport, then driving an electric vehicle or car sharing, and then driving a combustion vehicle, with that kind of list being the least bad to the most polluting. I guess the key thing in terms of the transport side of stuff is that it's not just about carbon either. One of the key things around transport by car is obviously the impact that it has upon local air quality as well. So in the UK, for example, each year there's 40,000 deaths a year that are attributable to poor air quality. And in most urban centres like London, between 60 and 70% of the air pollution comes from the transport sector. So this is a really important area to focus on, both in terms of reducing emissions but also in terms of improving public health outcomes. And then, of course, you've got the side benefits of things like walking and cycling more in terms of increasing people's activity, which has benefits for their physical health as well. So some colleagues from the Centre for Environmental Policy, with some people from Grantham, put together this graphic, which I'll explain. This was looking at whether it's better for the climate to drive an electric car or a petrol or diesel vehicle. So on the x-axis here, you've got some different cars, and this is from 2 or 3 years ago, so the stats are slightly out of date, but the same principle remains. So you've got a BMW i3, Nissan Leaf, and a Tesla Model S. And the green kind of picture of the globe gives an indication of the where we need to get to by 2040 in terms of carbon emissions of the sector. And then you've got the flags for the UK, for America, and for China. And the y-axis is the carbon dioxide emissions per kilometre driven. So obviously, by plugging in an electric car, how good or bad your car is will depend on a few things. The main criteria will probably be the emissions of the electricity that's coming into your vehicle, which will depend upon the energy mix of the grid. That's why in this case, the emissions from America are much higher than the UK, and China is higher still, because obviously there's a higher proportion of coal in America and in China in terms of the mix into the electricity grid. And so the difference, that's the difference between the countries. And then you've got a difference between the vehicles as well, which relates primarily to the size of the vehicle in terms of how consumptive those vehicles are of electricity, how much electricity it takes them to go a certain amount of distance. And the key message also is the comparison to the one on the right, which is the best-selling petrol car in each of those countries, which illustrates that their emissions are substantially lower per kilometre compared to the combustion vehicles from those particular countries. And there you'll see that America and China are inverted in terms of their relative positions compared to the electric vehicles. And that's because the average, also the best-selling petrol car in America is substantially larger, so uses more gas per kilometre and produces more carbon dioxide per kilometre than the best-selling car from China. There's an indication there of a clear difference between electric vehicles and combustion vehicles. But of course, the key question is also the embedded emissions of the battery. And so for most electric vehicles, all electric vehicles require more carbon dioxide to be produced because of the embedded carbon dioxide within the electric battery. So there's quite a significant difference there. And a guy called Ian Steffel from the Centre for Environmental Policy at Imperial did this analysis, which basically looked at I'll just move this so you can see it on the right-hand side, the length of time taken to kind of pay back that extra, those extra emissions from that's been required to produce the battery of the electric vehicle. And so the key conclusion was that it depends how long it takes to pay back, depending on how far you drive each year. The more you drive, the quicker it is per year, the quicker it is to pay back the extra carbon emissions, because as from the previous graph, the emissions per kilometre are so much lower for an electric vehicle. But the conclusion was it's typically 3 to 4 years for most hatchbacks to pay back the extra carbon that's been embedded in the battery of the electric vehicle. And after that point, all the more you drive is all savings in comparison to the emissions that would have happened if you were driving a combustion vehicle. So the fifth of our suggestions is around reducing your energy use and bills. So I'll focus on the domestic setting, obviously, for this. So it's most relevant to our individual behavioural changes. So for most people, it's typically between 70 and 80% of the energy that's used in the home is used for heating, space and water, and with the remaining obviously being used for electricity. Obviously, this does vary by house. And so I guess a key thing for consideration is the energy efficiency of individual appliances. And I'm sure you'll be familiar with these kind of energy efficiency labellings on the right-hand side. If we look, because in many cases, obviously we do have control over our heating in most cases, and there's stuff that we can do in terms of turning down the thermostat, heating water, having shorter showers, washing our clothes at lower temperatures, and so on. But in many cases, it's the electricity that's the thing that we often have kind of greatest amount of control over, to some extent, but in terms of appliances at least. So this is the breakdown of where our electricity use goes in the typical home. So around 63% of our electricity use goes into what are called cold appliances, so fridges and freezers, 10% into wet appliances, which are dishwashers and washing machines, cooking's around 7%, lighting around 6%, and then consumer electronics such as TVs, computers, consoles, and so on is around 4% of our electricity. And obviously, with each of these different things, there's various stuff that we can do in our day-to-day lives, which will reduce the consumption, from making sure that our fridges are properly defrosted, to washing our clothes at lower temperatures, to cooking with a lid on, to installing LED lighting, switching stuff on, and so on. And Energy Saving Trust in the UK have loads of stats on this. And so some of the questions that came out from you were, which are kind of covered off here. So the question was whether it makes a difference to change an energy supplier to one that is a renewable tariff. So obviously it won't change the physical electrons that come into your house, because that all comes from the grid, but it will make a difference in terms of incentivizing greater investment within the renewable energy sector, which in turn will help to increase the decarbonisation of the grid. Whether it's useful to take, or how much of an impact it has taking the stairs rather than taking a lift. Clearly it depends on how many levels of stairs you're going to be going up. And the only study I could find in my very brief check was from 10 years ago. So these stats will be slightly out of date by now. But it was suggesting that for the average person, they would emit between 60 and 120 kilos of carbon dioxide per year. So it was less, pretty much, well, just a bit less than 1% of a person's emissions would come from their use of lifts at work. But as I say, this is probably a bit lower than that now, because the UK's electricity has decarbonised considerably over the last 10 years. And then the question was on appliances left on standby, so whether that uses energy. So the answer is yes, but it varies substantially by different particular products as to how much electricity it uses. Some TVs left on standby can still use up to like 60 or 70% of the energy they use when they're actually turned on. But it would depend considerably on the appliance, and it also, going back to that image I had before with the energy performance labelling, that will make a clear difference as to how energy efficient that particular appliance is. So one thing I wanted to add in here, because it's always my favourite energy saving tip, and when I used to run this energy saving campaign called the Student Switch Off, this is the one that I always used to share. And so this is microwaving rice. So it's very small and nuanced, but I'll share it anyway. So this is just, it's an energy saving tip, it's a time saving tip, it also saves on washing up as well. And so this is just getting normal, whatever, Sainsbury's, Tesco's rice. You get 100 grams of it, rinse it, put it in a microwavable bowl, pour over twice the amount of boiled water, so in this case 200 millilitres, put it in the microwave for 11 minutes, and it comes out pretty much perfect every time. You don't have to sit watching it cook on the hob. It's super efficient, saves loads of time. Don't end up with loads of water over all of your hob and the gas going out because you've not been paying attention. Anyway, hopefully if there's one thing you take home from this, it's about saving yourself some time when you're cooking your rice. Anyway, but also it varies depending on your microwave and also depending on the rice, and it normally says on the side of the packet. So. Right, a whiz for a few of them. So this is around respecting and protecting green spaces. So about improving the quality of green space by planting more trees, which also has significant benefits for mental health and mental well-being as well. And I think during these last few months, I think we've probably all had developed a greater appreciation of green space as well, which is obviously good for mitigation as well as for our personal well-being, and also good for adapting to a warmer climate as well. Investing your money wisely. I'm sure that you know a lot more about this than I do, but yeah, encouraging within the people that we invest in and the people we have pensions into, be asking those questions as to whether we are investing in companies which are contributing towards the future that we want to see, essentially. Cutting consumption and waste. So this relates to the fact that they have far too much stuff in our day-to-day lives, which often we don't need or don't use enough. And in many cases, it's not making us any happier. So the kind of need for us to reduce the amount of fast fashion products that we buy, but also to be careful with the things that we buy, like food, in terms of trying to minimize the amount of food waste. So there's a really good organization which you've probably come across before, a kind of food sharing app called Olio, which have lots of really kind of engaging stats, engaging graphics. So I'll just quickly read these out. So according to Olio, well, not just according to them, according to various studies, a third of all food produced globally goes to waste. And so the two biggest components of that are at the kind of the end of the cycle. So that's sort of food that we bought, then going to waste in our houses and just getting put in the compost or in the bin. So in developed countries, over half of all food waste takes place in the home. And then the other major component for food waste is in the global south, with food not being able to be harvested quickly enough and basically, you know, rotting in the fields. So there's kind of key changes that need to happen at both ends of the spectrum in terms of technological developments, in terms of behavioural elements as well. So according to Olio, the annual value of food that's wasted globally is $1 trillion a year. And obviously the food that we waste doesn't just have a carbon footprint, it also has an impact upon water and biodiversity and stuff as well. And so 25% of the world's freshwater supply is used to grow food that's never eaten. So clear issues there in terms of stuff that we can also do in our day-to-day lives of whatever, buying wonky veg, and of maximising the chance that we don't put food in the bin by planning meals better and so on. And the last of the things which will be relevant to what we'll do now, or after we've taken Q&A, is around talking about the changes that you've made. So that's to kind of recognise that none of this stuff is easy. Well, some of this stuff is easy, but a lot of this stuff isn't easy. And the way in which we can maximise the chance that we meet these ambitious climate reduction goals is by talking to each other, to recognising that we're all experiencing challenges when we're trying to be reducing our carbon footprints. And that not all of it, many cases we don't have the solutions individually, but others on this call now probably do have experienced the same challenges before and will have come up with solutions to those challenges. And this is a little exercise that we'll do just after we've taken Q&A. Anyway, I appreciate I've rabbited on for longer than I was supposed to. So I'll stop there and take Q&A for 10 minutes before we then break into groups for 10 minutes or so.
Thank you very much, Neil. It was very interesting. I think we have a few questions in the chat. The first one is Asta. Asta, can you ask the question?
Yeah, I just wondered, you talked about the seasonality, and then, yeah, so would it be during the winter, would it be better to ship, e.g. a cucumber from Spain, or have it produced here in a greenhouse?
Ooh,
if you still want to eat it out of season.
Yeah, good question. I don't know. I mean, the shipping side of stuff, shipping is actually a very efficient way of moving products. So I don't know for certain the answer to your question, but shipping, I suspect it would probably be less carbon intensive to ship it, having been grown in a warmer country, than to grow it in the UK, where you've had to use the energy in the greenhouse in a climate which is not so conducive to growing that product. But I'm not 100%, and it will probably yeah. If I had to pin on anything, I would say it'd be better to ship it from Spain, but I'm not 100%.
Thanks.
Okay, I think Benoit has a question now. He's done a bit of math, quick math in his questions.
Yeah, is my microphone working?
Yep.
Yeah. So just about the beef and lamb figure you showed, is it right that it accounts for approximately 7% of global GHG emissions? And is it comparable to the around 3% of aviation or 3% of digital?
So I've got the first bit, but not the second part. Is it equivalent to? So what was the last part of your question?
Can we compare this figure to like, I think it's aviation is accounting for around 3% of global GHG emissions, and so does digital. So is it the same figure and we can compare that?
I think it's the same ballpark. I can't remember the exact stat off my head, but if you've just done the numbers based on those stats that are given, then that will be correct. Whatever it was, I'll go back to that. So going back to that slide. So you worked off the stats from here, I take it.
Yeah, I just multiplied the three numbers together to get.
If you've done that, that's correct. And I think I'm fairly certain you're right that it is. I think it's higher than the aviation sector from what I remember, but I'm not 100%. So yeah, it's clearly one of the and so in terms of it obviously depends on where we're at individually in terms of our own carbon emissions. But for most people, the single biggest thing that we can do is to reduce our to reduce our footprint is to reduce our consumption of meat, and beef is the single biggest thing because it's so carbon intensive.
I think next question is Julia. Julia, can you ask it or?
No, sorry, I didn't have a question.
Okay, so Cynthia, you have a question.
Yeah, I was just wondering if there are specific fish that are better to eat than others. Because I know some of them are like bred for eating, and then there are others that might harm like ecosystems. Yeah,
it's a good question. So I think as a rule of thumb, it's better to eat fish that are kind of lower down the food chain, so smaller fish, basically. And that's also, I think, better for some other reasons as well, in terms of, in terms of bioaccumulation. So you've got accumulation of things like of heavy metals, for example, which accumulate in the food chain. So the higher up the food chain you eat, so the fish that eat other fish is more likely to accumulate those things. And those are typically the species that are more endangered as well, because they're physically bigger, they have longer reproductive cycles, so take longer to get to the stage in their life cycle where they're larger. So rule of thumb, better to eat smaller fish. I'm not sure the difference actually, something I've not thought about before. I'm sure there is differences between freshwater and saltwater fish in terms of carbon footprint. I'm not sure about that. I guess for freshwater fish, you presumably you have lower transport emissions because you won't be going out into the deep ocean to farm those fish. On the stats that I mentioned, it's got really detailed breakdown, including different types of fish. So the difference of farmed fish versus natural fish as well. So if you're having farmed salmon, that has a higher carbon footprint than if you're having natural salmon. So if you go on that Our World in Data, or go back to the Poor and Nemetschek, I think they do have a breakdown by subgroups as well.
Okay, thank you. I think next is Davide. Davide, can you ask the question?
Yeah. Hi, Neil. Thanks for the speech. I was just curious to know, to calculate the emission impact of meat, do you take into consideration also the effect of deforestation, for example, to get soy or cereals for feeding the animals in intensive farmings? Yeah, so that's all taken into account in the calculations. If you go to the Poor and Nemetschek paper, it gives all the detail of the assumptions and the way they calculate stuff back. And it's interesting actually. So one of the questions which often comes up around the deforestation in the Amazon is, isn't this deforestation to produce soya, which it is in most cases, but that soy is primarily used to feed animals. So that deforestation that's taking place for growing a crop in that case wouldn't take place where we're not eating so much meat further up the food chain. But yes, I'm 99% certain that is included in the data.
Okay, I think next is Rob.
Hi Neil. Referring back to the mitigation hierarchy for working at home, you said it's the best way to do it. So, how do you balance the extra emission caused by working at home? Because some office building, they have the LEED Platinum certificate, the very low emission compared to some old detached houses that doesn't have a good insulation or double glazed windows. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a good question. And so I can't remember who did the analysis, but there was, well, analysis was done by the National Grid that basically showed that during lockdown there were substantial reductions overall in the energy consumption across the grid. So that kind of gives you the aggregate level, but of course that then misses some of the nuance which you allude to, which is correct, is that you could be working in a super efficient office, and if you're living in a really leaky, cold home, then yes, there will be cases where actually it would be better for you to be in that office. But as a rule of thumb, it would be better to be working from home, because well, yeah, I mean, so yeah, it also obviously depends how far away you live from your place of work and how you get to your work as to whether if you're driving a car to work versus if you're taking cycling to work, and you living, if you work in a really efficient place and you're getting there by a low carbon form of transport, then actually you could have scenarios where that ends up being better. But as a rule of thumb, that is the kind of hierarchy that you should be working through.
Thank you, Neil. And I think we have one last question from Mary about electric cars.
Yeah, so I know you mentioned that the payback period for the battery, but I was wondering in the slide that you showed before with the emissions per kilometers, if the emissions from production and end of life were included in that number or not.
Yes, they weren't included in that number. That was purely from the car on the road. Yeah, not including the production emissions at all.
Do you know how that changes maybe? Because I have no idea how much it compares, but I've had lots of conversations with people who told me an electric car is not better because of the production of batteries. So I was wondering if you...
Yeah, so that second graph that I showed with all the different types, like whatever it was, 10 different types of car. So that includes both the on-road emissions and the production emissions. So that includes everything. So that's the one to go to for your friends who are questioning that. And that's just to the conclusion of that is that for most hatchbacks, which is kind of an average family car, it's 3 to 4 years before the car pays back the emissions of associated with the production of the battery. And from then on, for every kilometre driven, you've got then that differential between, which you had on the graph before that, of it being about between half and a third of the carbon emissions associated with a combustion vehicle. And obviously the key thing also is the trajectory in that the grid is in most countries, and hopefully in all countries, is only going to get cleaner, whereas the emissions from petrol or diesel, there'll be some efficiency savings, but that's unlikely to be able to keep up with this efficiency savings, or sorry, the carbon reduction savings that are being made from decarbonisation of the grid. So yeah, petrol is not going to get much better, whereas electric vehicles will continue to get even better and better than they already are. Makes
sense. Thanks.
And then I think Ollie just came up with a question.
Yeah, sorry, I thought I'd just sneak that in. I just wanted to say thank you. It was really interesting. And sort of wondered what your opinion was on red meat and whether you see a scenario sort of 40, 50 years down the line where red meat is still part of people's lives, or whether you see sort of as people become more conscious of the effects it has, whether it will sort of dwindle out of modern day diets, or whether there's sort of a sustainable sort of eating it once a month from your local butcher sort of scenario.
Yeah, it's a really good question. Yeah, my instinct is that the overall consumption on a per capita basis will certainly be substantially reduced to where we are now. And I think if you look at the uptake of vegan, vegetarian and flexitarian diets, you've seen significant increases in that, particularly amongst younger generations. So there is this trend of moving away from certainly away from high meat consumption. So I don't envisage a situation where we'll ever move completely away from it. But I think it on a per capita basis, it will certainly need to be substantially reduced. And it's one of those things. So 2 years ago, I'm not here. I should have said actually at the time, it wasn't attempting to preach at all about vegan diet, and I'm not a vegan. I would class myself as being a flexitarian. I stopped eating beef and lamb for climate change reasons because they are just so bad. But I do enjoy occasional, roast chicken on a Sunday. So I suspect that, the trajectory there from the way in which young people are changing their behaviours is away from consumption of red meat in particular. Yeah, it's one of those things that it kind of needs to happen. So yeah, I think I kind of think it should become a situation where it's kind of meat is a treat, basically. And also you've got to think about the kind of technological progress that's being made in meat alternatives, where there's some really good alternatives coming now, which are relatively expensive at the moment, but you could easily have a situation in that amount of time where they are cheaper, they taste pretty much the same. So why would you have something with loads of carbon emissions, also with associated animal welfare questions, when you could have something which tastes pretty similar and is cheaper and is better for the environment?
That's great, thank you.
Okay, well, thank you for the questions. Thank you, Neil, for the presentation. We're going to put you guys in breakout rooms now for discussion. And discussion will be around 7 minutes because we don't have that much time left.
Sorry, I should have summarised what to discuss in the groups.
Oh yeah, sorry.
Which is on the slide here. There's basically, very briefly, an opportunity for you to talk about your own carbon footprint, but probably not enough time for that. So basically, some of the changes that you've made, the challenges you face, and how you've overcome them to share with other people so we can learn from each other. Thank you for all the questions, and the slides, happy for them to be shared if any of you want. I try to include the references where possible so you can kind of follow stuff back if that's of use. And as I mentioned at the start, next term we'll have a 3-hour lecture mixed in with some interactive activities where we'll be going through in more detail some of the kind of theories around behaviour change, about how we can maximise the chance that it's as easy as possible for individuals to make changes in their day-to-day lives. So just to reflect very briefly on the group that I was on, there's some really interesting discussions around some of the changes that people had made recently, talking about often how the kind of need to tackle one environmental issue is often related to another as well. So the kind of drive around reducing plastic waste and plastic pollution had often had encouraged some of the people in the group I was with to think about shopping more locally, and in terms of going to local markets to reduce the amount of plastic packaging, which has also been good for supporting the local economy, and in some cases meant that taking a kind of higher price point on some of the products there had meant that people had reduced their, I think in some cases reduced their meat consumption because those were slightly more expensive ones. I think yeah, some of the other people in the group were talking about the way in which they'd overall just trying to consume less on the whole, not necessarily focus on one specific area. But then on the other hand, which I thought was really interesting, was one of the people in the group mentioned how they'd kind of focused on one specific topic and just tried to go full in on addressing that one particular area and researching that one particular area first, whether that's food or whether that's transport, to properly understand the nuances of and the trade-offs that exist with the changes that you might need to make there, recognizing that we're all busy. There's lots of information out there and it can be a bit of a minefield. So kind of one of the recommendations from someone from our group was talking about focusing on one specific area, getting as much information as you can on that, making informed choices on that. And also, I guess a key take-home message is to recognize that we can't be perfect, and to recognize that we can all do what we can, and that actually a really important thing is to not let the perfect be the enemy of the good, or whatever that phrase is. To recognize there's all stuff that we can do in our day-to-day lives, and everything does count, and it counts not just for our own personal footprint, but going back to that quote from Greta Thunberg at the start, it's also important for the message that it sends out to those around us that this is an important thing to be doing, and that in many cases it's something which is good for our health, good for our well-being, as well as being good for the environment as well. Anyway, it's 6 o'clock. And now we've all got homes to go to, so I shall finish there, but hand back to Felix in case you've got anything else to finish it off with.
Nope, all good. Thank you, Neil, for finishing on those positive notes. And thank you, everyone, for coming. Can we all give Neil a round of applause, please?
Cool. Thanks, everyone. Have a good evening. Bye.